I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. The BRICS Plus Summit was held in the Russian city of Kazan this past October. The original BRICS comprised 4 countries. It was Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And the first meeting that they held was in 2009. South Africa joined in 2011. BRICS has now grown to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. And the recent summit also invited 13 countries to the group as partner states. Countries that have expressed interest in joining BRICS include Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, which is a U.S. treaty ally, and Turkey, which is a member of NATO. As countries in the global south flock to form an increasingly significant geopolitical bloc, in which China has assumed a leading role, it's important to understand how BRICS Plus fits into China's foreign policy strategy and the role that the BRICS mechanism is likely to play going forward. To discuss these issues, I am delighted to be joined by Alexander Gabuev. He is director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, which is based in Berlin, and his research focuses on Chinese and Russian foreign policy. Welcome to the China Global Podcast, Sasha.
It's great to be back, Bonnie. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with a question about the BRICS itself. Why was BRICS created, and what are the goals and purposes that it is intended to achieve, and have they changed over time?
The original BRICS was an invention of Goldman Sachs chief economist by the time, 20 years ago, Jim O'Neill, who created this frame. Originally it was BRIC, so Brazil, Russia, India, and China, as a group of the most dynamic developing economies that had potential for big growth. And this intellectual frame also helped Goldman Sachs, obviously, to make money and create various portfolios with papers, bonds, shares from these 4 economies. But then around 2006, the Russians decided that these groupings should have a political life of its own and started to create a framework where officials from the 4 countries would meet. And the group was very much in demand following the global credit crunch of 2008-2009. So the first in-person forum of the leaders was really called to life by the global recession. That it added S to represent South Africa and to claim global representativeness. The idea of the group was that the current system of redistribution of voting rights in Bretton Woods institutions, particularly the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, doesn't really reflect the changes in the global economy over the last 30 years. Developing countries, including largest economies like China and India, are underrepresented, whereas some Western economies, particularly European economies, are overrepresented. And the goal was that these countries wanted to have adjustments to the existing rules and to say, hey, the system doesn't function according to the rules as they were written, and we want this adjustments. But over time, I think BRICS is evolving into a large forum of non-West, where obviously China is among the leading nations.
So how does BRICS actually fit into Chinese foreign policy objectives? We've seen in recent years that the global south has become a much higher priority for China. So how does BRICS and BRICS Plus, of course, fit into this? And how does it differ from China's other approaches to engaging with the global south?
I think that China has an ambiguous attitude towards the global south, whether China is to some extent part of the global south, or it's really a separate entity that has this friendly, amicable partnership relationship with the global south, but it's not part of it. I don't think that there is a very clear-cut answer, but over time, it's just very difficult for China to say that it's just a large developing nation and it is part of the global south. So it's obviously a separate power that has its own vision. And if we talk about Xi Jinping, the first big project was Belt and Road that meant to connect China to many parts of the world, including the global south. So BRICS was inherited by Xi Jinping participation in BRICS from Hu Jintao era. And I think that the membership itself was retooled and reprogrammed to reflect this broadening ambitions of China to represent the non-West and restructure the global international norms. So BRICS is the most representative fora of China and the global south, where China is institutionally part of the same organization, and it can take a lead to create norms that China sees are more just and that China pitches to global south as more inclusive and something better that fits in their development goals or interests rather than anything what the West can suggest.
How dominant is China in the BRICS? Is it really driving the group's agenda? Is it able to push through what it wants to achieve, or does it have to compromise with other countries?
China is obviously the largest economy in BRICS. It is the most robust diplomatic presence around the world and in countries that are both BRICS members and parts of the global south. And if you look at BRICS itself, particularly since the expansion, all of the members are not necessarily that much connected among themselves. Like, for example, members of US alliances are connected to the United States through security, but also economic, technological ties, people-to-people exchanges. There is not that much that unites all of the original 5 countries other than their connection to China. They trade much more with China individually than they trade between themselves. So China has obviously leverage inside BRICS. Since the tilt in Russian foreign policy when Putin illegally has invaded Ukraine in February 22, Russia is increasingly an anti-Western power and enabler of Chinese narratives, Chinese approaches to global governance, because Russia is increasingly a junior partner of China. So among the core 5 members, China is one, and it has Russia as a junior partner that shares a lot of Chinese approaches and sometimes is even more vocal and aggressive. I think that other countries are somewhat more skeptical to Chinese role. Particularly, the key issue for them is framing of BRICS as an organization and a movement that wants an adjustment of existing rules and is not in any antagonistic relationship to the West, but wants some reforms. Or is it a movement that really wants to dethrone the rules-based international order that the United States and the West advocate? And I think that there is a split that's not necessarily very explicit in BRICS, but it's very palpable, where on one side we have China, and on the other side we have India and Brazil among the original members that would take a much less controversial and cautious approach. So China has a lot of leverage, but it is not an unquestioned leader and boss of the BRICS.
I really want to hear more of your analysis, Sasha, about Russian and Chinese interests in the BRICS and whether they completely align. In China's wording and language, where they talk about global governance reform, you get the impression they want to adjust global governance. They want to insert their own norms. But people often say that Moscow wants to sort of overthrow the international order, and China wants to either tweak it, revise it, but not necessarily sow chaos and undermine the international order. So if you agree with that, if not, of course, you can describe it differently. But if that is the case, then is there competition or cooperation between Moscow and Beijing in the BRICS Plus, or are both maybe existing simultaneously?
I think that let's take a step back and talk about the Chinese vision for the global order. And I think that it's definitely baked in Chinese expectations that they will have a more prominent role in shaping what's emerging after the unipolar moment that's definitely over. But the new world order is emerging, and China definitely wants to not be only at the table where these norms are written, but definitely shape and drive the changes. At the same time, I think that the norms that China wants to advocate are sketchy. And in some parts, China more or less knows what it wants, definitely wants much more respect for sovereignty of great powers, first and foremost, China's own sovereignty and the unquestioned ability of the Communist Party of China to define how China is governed internally and that nobody else interferes in Chinese domestic affairs, and wants to advocate norms focused around sovereignty. But at the same time, we see that China sometimes infringes on sovereignty of its neighbors or weaker players in the international system. I wouldn't say that China is the only big country that does this to others. Russia comes to mind, but also the United States, where it feels that some of the norms that brutal regimes are pursuing domestically are in violation with fundamental values that US stands for. So I think it's tricky. But China obviously has benefited a lot from the system that has existed for decades, underwritten by the US as we know it. And it probably wants to see guarded and just incremental reforms replacing the US in some areas or having more space together with the US, while it maybe is okay with the norms. For example, WTO norms to some extent are working for China in their previous iteration. They don't work for the US anymore. But in many aspects, China doesn't necessarily have a very clear idea of what it's looking for other than just more say, more influence, more power. Russia is a very different player. It's not as globalized, as technologically advanced, as invested in many of today's current problems as China is. China is a truly global power that's very mighty, but at the same time, very intertwined with the health of the global economic system, global technological landscape, affected by what's going on in the world and fragile to an extent. Russia is like much more open to the world than North Korea, but it cares far less about the global outcomes. So it can be just much more disruptive. And Putin has a very narrow tunnel vision now about his competition or fight against the West and the United States. So he wants to really overthrow the US as the leader of the current system. And I think that there is just this big gap at one point in terms of means and the pace and the aggressiveness. But at the same time, displacing or reducing the role of the United States in the current international system is the goal that is shared. And then China and Russia can find common ground in how they work towards this goal together.
Was it China's initiative to expand BRICS? Clearly, you could argue that the inclusion of more countries with very diverse interests makes it more difficult to reach a consensus on anything. And if you look at this first meeting that was held with more countries and now the fact that it may be further expanded. So what do you think is the impact of the addition of more countries, and how does this advance China's agenda? Is it because they just want to have as many countries as possible and increase the amount of GDP, global GDP, that is covered by the countries in BRICS? Do they see the upsides as outweighing the downsides?
I think that here you have a real challenge for the Chinese leadership because running multilateral organizations where you are the largest animal and the leader is something that's really new for them. Like they have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they have BRICS, and I don't think that they fully grasp the challenges or they have a very clear cut ideas on how to do that, provided that all of the members of these organizations have divergent security interests, they have divergent economic interests, they don't share values necessarily, and some of them, most prominently India, have direct security problems with China driven by the border issues and disagreements and the broader perception of rising China as a challenge to Indian sovereignty and Indian position in the region and the world. So I think that here the Chinese leadership has a challenge, and the first reaction is that, oh, since we have this wonderful organization where we are in the lead, though informally, we need to expand it. So the bigger it is, the more it provides resources for China, and that it's a multi-tool organization that we can use in whatever way we figure out later. So the bigger it gets, the better it is for China. And I think that the drive to expand it that was coming at the last year's summit was really originating from China, vigorously supported by Moscow, and Beijing and Moscow found ways to persuade Brazil, India, and South Africa that opposing BRICS expansion is really contradicts the BRICS spirit, to use the language that the Chinese and Russian diplomats are using, and it really is blocking the progress of the organization. But this summit in Kazan has very clearly demonstrated that once you take new members on board, making the organization more functional becomes a real challenge because the new members are so diverse. They are not necessarily very interested in sharing all of the agenda items that Beijing or Moscow want to advocate. And we've also seen that there's this curious case of Saudi Arabia membership where Saudi Arabia officially claims that it has expressed interest but not fully joined. The Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, instead of going to Kazan, went to Brussels for the first summit with the EU Commission leadership. So I think that China right now experiences tremendous challenges in how to make this organization more cohesive. Now it's advocated for its expansion.
Is there anything noteworthy that was included in the Kazan declaration that was issued after the latest BRICS Plus summit? And does it tell us anything about the future actions or direction of BRICS?
I think there are a couple of things that are important that are there in the document, and there are a couple of things that are important that are not there in the document. First and foremost, you just try to note how many times BRICS members in the Kazan Declaration say that they support the current norms, that they don't oppose the existing order, and that whatever they are doing is really in supplement to the Bretton Woods institution, and that upholding the rules is shared interest. So there is not that much novelty that would be offered by China or the Russian hosts, for that matter, that would be really something revolutionary, new, and interesting to anybody. Basically, it's when they say on reform of IMF and so on that, oh, something that we've agreed should be continued. So that's one. I think two is that a lot of stuff that Russia was advocating for example, oh, we should have a new BRICS currency, or we should have this new means for financial messages exchange system that's like SWIFT, but different, that would be not dominated by the West. That was not supported by other members. And there are just very material problems on how to bring that to life. And I think that it represents challenge going forward. So whether China will be able to create a vision that will be supported by other BRICS members and put into communique remains to be seen. Final point, G7 declarations are also tend to be lengthy and abstract, but there are many lines in them that say we as G7 countries will collectively do X, Y, Z, and invest this amount of money into that. So a lot of the items on G7 declarations are really actionable, and there is money put behind some G7 initiatives. That's nothing to be seen in BRICS declarations. Like, they create some new formats, but there is not that much money on the table. And the power of collective action of BRICS lags far behind the power of collective actions of G7 led by the US, at least for now.
So you mentioned the possibility of a BRICS currency, and so much of the analysis that we have seen, I think, about BRICS really focuses on the possibility of the creation of a new currency that would challenge the dominance of the US dollar in the long run, because I don't think anybody expects that this would happen in the near term. But is this the area that China is this its top priority? And is this the area where China is perhaps more frustrated and disappointed? Did China think from the beginning, as BRICS was created, that this would be something they would like to advance? And here we are in 2024. Very little progress has really been made toward challenging the dominance of the US dollar.
I think that on the currency, China is not very supportive. This item was inserted into agenda by insistence of Russia. And that's really not a very functional idea, because the economies are so different. Even the US doesn't have the same currency with its allies. Imagine the US advocating to have the same G7 currency. Like, it's absolutely non-functional, and the US would not try to push on Japan and its partners in Europe to use the United States dollar. Like, US is happy to have the US dollar as the major global currency that's really underwrites the global financial system. So I think that this idea is really not functional. No BRICS country wants to surrender its sovereignty in monetary policy. China is definitely the least among them to abandon the currency of their own and go into a synthetic BRICS currency. I think the Chinese interest, though, is much more in creating an infrastructure for clearing transactions in bilateral, so national currencies that would circumvent the international systems like SWIFT that are underpinned by the US dollar dominance, or the global financial institutions that are mostly US based. So the interest in promoting bilateral settlement in bilateral currencies is there. Problem is that many of these currencies are very not easy to use, and RMB is a good example for that. It's not fully convertible. If you trade with China and RMB, sometimes, well, good luck getting your money and payments out of China. So storing value for both companies and nations in RMB is also tricky for the same reason. And, well, RMB is not alone. Indian rupee is very similar. So here China is, in theory, interested in kind of creating this alternative mechanism that will decrease the role of US dollar, potentially increase role of RMB, and make the Chinese economy more, and the economy of its major trading partners, more immune to US pressure through economic sanctions. But it's very hard to do. And I think that the fact that no BRICS country really wanted to seriously engage in this effort, despite kind of Russia's lobbying and shared interest, is pretty much telling how much work will need to be done. However, I would not totally dismiss this as fantasy land. It's something that will never, ever happen. People might be skeptical about the rise of share of RMB in global trade settlement. It's below 5% still. If we look at SWIFT data, and you could say like, well, it's a very far cry from where the US dollar or euro are, and that will take Chinese centuries to get there. But I think that people are looking at the overdrive of economic sanctions, and they look at Russia's experience to de-dollarize its economy, where Russia started to work on this goal since 2014 and brought itself to a position by the time that Putin decided to invade Ukraine in 2022, where the shocks unleashed by the sanctions was something that Russia managed over time, and that the economy didn't collapse because of this prep war. So if some countries that are not necessarily upholding democratic norms or envision that they would have contradictions with the United States are concerned about potential use of financial sanctions by Washington, they might start to diversify away from US dollar very gradually, but putting additional tools, including bilateral currency swaps with China and other major trading partners, in order to get themselves some antibodies against potential tools of US coercion. And I think that the interest is shared quite widely. It's not that countries just look at Russia's behavior and at the punishment and say like, oh, we will never kill political dissidents in foreign consulates, or we'll never repress human rights at all. I think that many countries have, or rulers of these countries have, very different opinions. So that's one. So the interest is there, and it's shared beyond China and Russia. The second part is that many officials and finance people from BRICS countries I've been talking to over the last year are saying that we look at the US domestic financial situation and it doesn't look healthy over the long run. So the pace of growing budget deficit and the pace of growing domestic debt with no tangible solution in sight is unsustainable over the long run. So if that's the problem, we really want to find some ways to hedge, because that's long-term our overexposure to the US dollar is a potential risk. They don't have an answer yet, but they're definitely interested in finding this answer. And to me, BRICS is really the sandbox where a lot of smart people from non-West are brainstorming of what the solution or set of solutions could be. So I wouldn't totally dismiss that as a format and as a problem where people will try to kind of navigate their way.
Interesting. So if we inject into this conversation U.S. politics now, the return of Donald Trump to the White House in January, how might that influence how Beijing and maybe also Russia will seek to use BRICS Plus to advance their interests?
I think that it really very much depends on what Donald Trump will do, and that's unpredictable. I don't claim to have any crystal ball at what this incoming team will do. And we don't even know who the next Secretary of Treasury will be, and that will be maybe important, but maybe not. How do we know? I think that what we can say is that this presidency is very likely to bring a lot of disruption. It's very likely to bring the temptation to use coercion even more in sometimes erratic, undisciplined manner that will increase fears of multiple capitals that, the US is becoming too aggressive, sometimes inconsistently aggressive. And as much as we don't want to disrupt our relationship with Trump, we want to please him, we don't want to be on his bad list, we definitely over the long term need quite to build these tools of domestic resilience that make us less dependent on the United States. And I think that's definitely a mood and spirit that countries like China and Russia will try to exploit. The problem is that probably Brazil and India in the next 4 years will be more leading towards let's try to exploit this presidency and let's not become problematic countries for the United States, and let's try to pocket whatever gains Trump's White House might send our way for standing up to China. And I think that China will be in an increasingly challenging position because we all know that on the countries list, if Trump's team sees anything kind of as a problem, and Trump himself, the country that comes to mind as number one challenge is definitely China.
So finally, I wanted to ask you about policy recommendations that you have, and you've recently co-authored a piece that I think was published on the Carnegie website about how the U.S. And the West should respond to the BRICS Plus, and particularly some of the efforts at undermining the U.S. dollar. So maybe even more broadly, how should we respond to an increasingly multipolar world that China is seeking to lead, and what should be the responses to China's effort to dominate global governance reform? China certainly has ambitions to be the leader, or at least a leader of the international order, and shape it in ways that would be more advantageous to its interests. So, what should be the response of Western countries?
Well, the most practical problem of the U.S. fiscal position is definitely something that the U.S. would really, in an ideal world, find ways to sort out. That was solvable before. You can grow out the current dependency on debt instruments and widening budget deficit. It probably would be a policy that leads you out of that. I will not have any specific recommendation, but I would just point that this is very important if you want to stay relevant and have the same leverage and influence in the international system. And there is a tech element to that, because I think that India, China, and even Russia are much more advanced in areas like digital currencies of the central bank, in all of the protocols, and they're far ahead of the United States, despite the U.S. tremendous technological advantage, including in financial technologies. So working around that would definitely be helpful. Second part is that the fact that IMF and the World Bank are still led by Americans and Europeans doesn't sound right. It sounds very Western-centric in an increasingly more diverse and multipolar world. So searching a new IMF chief beyond Europe and searching the next World Bank chief beyond the United States would probably be the step in the right direction that would give other countries a sense that the international system is indeed becoming more democratic, it's becoming more inclusive, and they have a stake in supporting the current rules that the West and the US are ultimately underwriting, and that the West is committed to the latter of obligations of the rules that were written originally. Third point would be if people believe that you can coerce other countries to not take part in BRICS and that you can disrupt the efficiency of BRICS by just talking other countries out, I think that this policy hasn't really worked well. And sometimes on a short period of time, it can be efficient, but over a long time, I think that countries find their way to reduce visibility of their participation in this organization and then expand the practical benefits of that. So working with countries inside BRICS Plus that are interested in upholding the current system and are more interested in evolution rather than revolution, so more reform and adjustment. I think Brazil and India are the first that come to my mind, would be the right way forward. Finally, editorial comment would be that I think that everybody in the world would benefit if there is a healthy degree of competition between China, the United States, and maybe other places. I'm illiterate about baseball. I think that's an American religion that we Russians don't claim to understand. I like tennis. If competition between China and the United States and maybe other countries like India and even Russia in the long run would be competition between Novak Djokovic and Rafa Nadal and Federer. And that would be improving the game and fixing problems, including climate change, the governance of AI and disruptive technologies. Everybody would benefit. Just how to find this way to make it more creative tension and competition that is not really harmful and kinetic is a problem, and it requires really a win-win approach that it's very hard to see in any of the big capitals.
Fantastic. Well, we've been talking with Alexander Gabuev, who is director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center based in Berlin. And thank you so much for joining the China Global Podcast, Sasha.
Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for listening to this.